The Duke came to collect a debt, and found a small boy stitching his mother's coat. The air in the cottage was thin and cold, smelling of damp wool and the last of the peat fire. It clung to the back of Alara's throat, a familiar taste of poverty. Her fingers, chapped and red, worked the thick needle through the coarse fabric of her only coat. The seam along the shoulder had given way, and winter was a wolf at the door, its breath already frosting the single pane of glass in the window. Beside her on the low stool, her son, Leo, mimicked her movements with a fierce, childish concentration that both broke her heart and filled it with a defiant pride. He held a length of twine and a blunted darning needle, his small hands struggling to push it through a scrap piece of burlap. He was 6 years old and already learning the cartography of mending, of making do, of holding things together when they threatened to fall apart. Outside, the crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel path was a sound as final as a judge's gavel. Alara's own hands stilled. The needle paused mid-stitch. This was it. The day she had been dreading since the letter arrived, sealed with a severe black wax stamp bearing the crest of a wolf's head. The Duke of Blackwood. A name spoken in the village in hushed, fearful tones. A recluse. A monster, some said, scarred by war and soured on the world. And he was the man who now owned her husband's debts, and by extension, this small cottage and the very ground beneath it. "Is that the man from the letter, Mama?" Leo's voice was a small, piping whisper, his big brown eyes fixed on her face, searching for a reassurance she did not possess. "It is," she said, forcing her lips into a calm line. She placed her coat aside. "Stay here, my love, and be quiet as a mouse." She rose, her spine straight, her worn homespun dress a poor sort of armor against the power that was about to step through her door. She smoothed it down, a useless gesture, and took a deep breath. She had nothing to offer him but her dignity. She prayed it would be enough. The knock on the door was not a knock. It was a summons, hard and imperious. She opened it to a wall of a man. The Duke of Blackwood was taller than the stories suggested, broader in the shoulder, his presence seeming to consume the very light in the doorway. He was dressed in immaculate, severe black, from his polished riding boots to the high collar of his greatcoat. His face was a study in harsh angles, his jaw tight, his mouth a thin, unyielding line. And then there were his eyes, a startling glacial gray, cold and empty as a winter sky. A jagged scar, pale and silvered, cut down from his left temple, narrowly missing his eye and disappearing into the line of his dark hair. It was a fearsome sight, a testament to the violence that had forged him. He looked at her, and his gaze was not merely dismissive. It was utterly devoid of interest, as if she were no different from the peeling paint on the doorframe. His internal world was a fortress of ice. Alistair, the Duke of Blackwood, had come here to perform a necessary, if distasteful, piece of estate business. Foreclosure. The word was ugly, but efficient. This cottage, and the tenant farmer's debt attached to it, was the last messy thread from his late brother's disastrous financial affairs. Alistair's life was now dedicated to cauterizing the wounds his brother had left behind, imposing order on chaos with ruthless precision. He had expected a weeping woman, a cowering man, perhaps a plea for mercy he was fully prepared to ignore. Mercy was a luxury he had burned out of himself on the battlefields of the continent. He stepped inside without invitation, his gaze sweeping the single, sparse room. It was clean, he noted with detached surprise, but achingly bare. A table, 2 stools, a narrow cot in the corner, a hearth with only pale embers. His eyes landed on the source of the faint scratching sound he'd heard, and the ice in his soul fractured. A small boy sat on a stool by the hearth, his head bent in concentration. In his hands was a thick needle, far too large for him, and he was painstakingly pulling a piece of rough twine through the worn shoulder of a woman's coat. He was not playing. His brow was furrowed with the gravity of his work, his small tongue caught between his teeth. He was trying to mend his mother's coat. The Duke came to collect a debt, and found a small boy stitching his mother's coat. The image struck Alistair with the force of a physical blow, a shard of unexpected warmth piercing his frozen core. It was a tableau of such desperate, earnest love that it made a mockery of his cold intentions. This was not a matter of ledgers and coin. This was a boy trying to keep his mother warm. "Your Grace," the woman said. Her voice was steady, low, and held no trace of the pleading he had expected. It drew his attention back to her. She stood tall, her chin lifted. She was not a classic beauty, but her face had a strength to it, framed by dark hair pulled back severely. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, met his without flinching. He had come to evict a debtor. He had found a lioness guarding her cub. "You are the widow of Thomas Fletcher?" His voice was a harsh rasp, rougher than he'd intended. "I am Ilara Fletcher." He gestured vaguely at the papers held by the steward who waited silently behind him. "The debt is considerable. The estate cannot carry it." It was the speech he had prepared. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. He was looking at her, but he was seeing the boy, seeing the tiny, determined stitches. Ilara's hands clenched at her sides. "I am aware of the debt, Your Grace. I have nothing. This cottage is all we possess. If you mean to turn us out, do so, but do not expect me to beg." Her defiance was another unexpected shock. It was not insolence, but a profound, unshakable dignity that radiated from her. She would not be diminished, even in her ruin. Alistair felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years. Uncertainty. The cold, clear path he had set for himself was suddenly shrouded in fog. He looked from the woman's proud, weary face to the small boy, who had finally looked up, his eyes wide and solemn, the needle clutched in his hand like a tiny sword. Alistair's mind, usually a fortress of logic and calculation, was in turmoil. He could not throw them out. The thought, which should have been a simple matter of business, was now monstrous. That small, determined boy would haunt him. He needed to contain this. He needed a new solution, one that imposed order without this raw, aching humanity. "There may be an alternative," he heard himself say, the words forming before he had consciously willed them. Ilara watched him, her expression wary. Hope was a dangerous, fragile thing, and she did not trust it, especially from a man with eyes as cold as his. "My housekeeper at the manor has recently departed," he stated, the idea solidifying as he spoke. "The position is vacant. Blackwood Manor is large. It requires a custodian." Ilara's breath caught. He was offering her employment? The Duke? "You would have me be your housekeeper. The value of your labor would be credited against the debt," he continued, his tone clipped and businesslike, a retreat into familiar territory. "You would have lodging. Your son would be provided for." He said the word son, as if it were a foreign object in his mouth. "It is a practical arrangement. The debt is settled, and my house is kept. Do you accept?" It was not a question. It was a command wrapped in the guise of an offer. She looked around her small, cold cottage, the only home she and Leo had ever known. Then she looked at the Duke, this formidable, wounded man. To go to Blackwood Manor was to enter the wolf's den. The place was spoken of as a tomb, a place of shadows and sorrow, lorded over by a ghost. But it was a roof. It was food. It was a way to keep Leo safe. She had no choice. "I accept," she said, her voice clear. "On 2 conditions." Alistair's eyebrow rose, a flicker of disbelief crossing his severe features. "Conditions? My son stays with me. He is not to be relegated to some forgotten corner of the house. Where I am, he is. That was implied in my offer," he conceded, a touch impatiently. "And second," she pressed on, her gaze unwavering, "I am your employee. I will work to earn my keep and pay what is owed. I am not your ward, nor your charity. I expect to be treated with the respect due to my position. Nothing more, and nothing less." For a long moment he simply stared at her. He had dealt with sycophants, with schemers, with terrified aristocrats and cunning merchants. He had never dealt with a woman who, while standing on the precipice of ruin, negotiated the terms of her own servitude. The ice within him did not melt, but he felt a grudging, unfamiliar respect. Agreed, he bit out. Pack your things. The carriage will return for you in 1 hour. With that, he turned on his heel and strode out, his greatcoat swirling around him like a dark storm cloud. The steward, looking flustered, bowed jerkily and followed. The carriage door slammed shut, and the sound of the wheels crunching away was the sound of her old life ending. Alara let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her knees suddenly weak. She sank onto the stool, pulling Leo into her arms. He buried his face in her dress, his small body trembling slightly. "We're leaving our home, Mama." "Yes, my love," she whispered, stroking his hair. "We are going to a new place, a large castle. The scary man's castle." Alara looked out the window at the bleak, gray sky. "Yes," she said softly. "The scary man's castle." The journey to Blackwood Manor was a passage into deepening gloom. A persistent, weeping rain began to fall, smearing the world outside the carriage window into a gray blur. Leo, lulled by the rocking motion, eventually fell asleep with his head in her lap, his small hand clutching a wooden bird his father had carved for him. Alara watched the landscape change, the gentle, rolling fields giving way to a wilder, more forbidding terrain of craggy hills and ancient, twisted oaks. The estate itself was vast and untamed, the road little more than a rutted track through dense, dark woods. And then the manor appeared, a silhouette against the bruised sky. It was not a house. It was a fortress, a sprawling edifice of dark gray stone, bristling with Gothic towers and severe, unblinking windows. It seemed to have risen from the rock of the earth itself, a monument to sorrow and isolation. No lights shone from its windows. No smoke rose from its many chimneys. It looked as cold, as forbidding, and as wounded as its master. Alistair was waiting for them in the grand entrance hall, a cavernous space of cold marble and shadowed arches. The air was frigid, smelling of dust and disuse. Their footsteps echoed unervingly in the oppressive silence. "Mrs. Gable, the cook, is the only other permanent staff," the Duke stated, his voice flat. "She will show you to your quarters. Your duties will begin in the morning." He did not look at Alara, his gaze fixed somewhere over her head, as if already regretting his impulsive decision. He seemed eager to retreat back into whatever shadows he inhabited in this great, empty place. He turned to leave, but a small voice stopped him. "Your Grace." Alistair froze, turning slowly. Leo stood beside his mother, no longer hiding behind her skirts. He held up the small, carved wooden bird. "My papa made this. It's a kestrel. Do you have kestrels in your woods?" The question was so simple, so innocent, it was like a sunbeam striking a dungeon wall. Alistair stared at the boy, at the offering in his small hand. He seemed at a loss, the Duke of Blackwood, master of this vast domain, rendered speechless by a child's question about a bird. His throat worked. "Yes," he said, the single word sounding like stone grinding on stone. "There are kestrels in the woods." He then turned abruptly and disappeared down a long, dark corridor, his footsteps swallowed by the immense silence of the house. Alara watched him go, a shiver running down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. She had agreed to work in a duke's home, but she had a terrible feeling she had just entered a tomb. The first weeks at Blackwood Manor were an exercise in endurance. The house was a labyrinth of forgotten rooms, draped in dust sheets like so many shrouds. Alara worked from dawn until dusk, her hands raw from lye soap and cold water, her body aching with a fatigue that settled deep in her bones. She swept away cobwebs that felt as old as the stone walls, polished silver that had not seen the light in a generation, and aired out rooms that seemed to hold their breath in a perpetual state of mourning. She was trying to impose order, to breathe life into the suffocating stillness, but it was like trying to warm a glacier with a single candle. Leo was her shadow, a small, quiet presence in the echoing immensity of the manor. He helped where he could, dusting the legs of chairs or carrying rags, his solemnity a strange counterpoint to his youth. The Duke remained a ghost, a fleeting presence in the long corridors, a closed door at the end of the West Wing. He took his meals alone in his study. He spoke only to issue a clipped order or to answer a direct question. He was a creature of routine and shadow, and he made it clear through his every action that the arrangement was one of business, not of fellowship. Yet, Alara's presence was a disruption he could not ignore. The scent of beeswax and lemon now replaced the musty smell in the main hall. A bowl of late-blooming roses from the overgrown garden appeared on a side table. Small, imperceptible changes that chipped away at the manor's grim austerity. He found himself pausing by the library door, listening to the soft murmur of her voice as she read to Leo in the evenings by the fire she insisted on lighting. The sound was an intrusion, a note of warmth in his carefully curated desolation, and it both irritated and intrigued him. He was a man who had forgotten the sound of a home. The storm broke on a Tuesday. It rolled in from the coast without warning, a furious assault of wind and rain that lashed against the manor's stone walls. The sky turned a bruised purple-black, and the wind howled through the chimneys like a tormented spirit. The world outside the windows was a maelstrom of violent water and thrashing trees. Inside, the old house groaned and shuddered, the flickering candlelight casting long, dancing shadows that turned familiar shapes into monsters. Leo, usually so stoic, was terrified. He huddled in Alara's lap in their small attic room, his hands pressed over his ears to block out the thunder that cracked like the sky itself was breaking apart. Alara held him tight, murmuring soothing words, her own heart thudding in time with the storm's rhythm. It was well past midnight when a crash from downstairs, louder than any thunder, jolted her. It sounded like a heavy piece of furniture toppling over, followed by a splintering of wood. Her first thought was that the storm had broken a window, but the sound had come from the West Wing, from the Duke's study. "Stay here, Leo," she whispered, tucking the blanket around him. "I'll be right back." Her heart hammered against her ribs as she lit a candle and crept down the servants' stairs. The main house was pitch black and silent, save for the roar of the storm. The door to the study was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness in the greater dark. Pushing it open, she lifted her candle. The scene before her stole her breath. A large bookshelf had been overturned, its contents spilled across the floor. Papers and heavy tomes lay scattered like fallen leaves. And in the center of the chaos stood the Duke. He was not the cold, controlled man she knew. He was breathing heavily, his back to her, one hand braced against the mantelpiece. His formal jacket was gone, his white shirt soaked with what she first thought was rain, but she saw no broken window. He was drenched in sweat. As another boom of thunder shook the house, he flinched violently, a low, guttural sound torn from his throat. He was not seeing the room. His eyes, wide and unfocused, were staring at horrors only he could see. The storm was not just outside. It was inside him, a tempest of memory and pain. "Your Grace," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. He spun around, his face a mask of primal fear. For a terrifying second, he didn't recognize her. His glacial eyes were wild, haunted. He looked at her as if she were an enemy soldier emerging from the smoke. "Alistair," she said, her voice firmer now, using his given name without thinking. It was a risk, a breach of every protocol, but she sensed the Duke was not there to hear it. Only the man. Her voice, her presence, seemed to tether him back to the present. His gaze slowly cleared, the wildness receding, replaced by a dawning, horrified awareness. He looked from her face to the wreckage of the room, and a deep, shuddering breath escaped him. The rigid control he maintained at all times had shattered completely. "The storm," he managed to say, his voice a raw, broken thing. "The cannons. It sounds like the cannons." And then she understood. This was not a storm to him. It was the sound of war. The battlefield he had survived in body had clearly followed him home to haunt his soul. Without a word, she set her candle down on a clear space on the desk. She walked to the hearth, where the embers still glowed faintly, and added a few small logs. She didn't fuss or pry. She simply moved with a quiet, practical purpose. She righted a fallen chair, her movements calm and steady in the chaotic room. He watched her, his breathing still ragged. He expected fear or perhaps pity. He received neither. What he saw in her face was a profound, sorrowful understanding. She was not afraid of his demons. She retrieved a decanter of brandy and a glass from a sideboard, her hand steady as she poured a small measure. She held it out to him. "This will help." He stared at the glass, then at her. His own hand was trembling, a weakness he despised. He reached out and took it, their fingers brushing for a fleeting moment. Her skin was warm, a stark contrast to the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He drank the brandy in a single, rough swallow, the fiery liquid a welcome shock to his system. He sank into the chair she had righted, burying his face in his hands. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the dying storm and the crackle of the newly kindled fire. "Forgive the intrusion," he said finally, his voice muffled. "You should not have seen that." "There is nothing to forgive," she replied quietly, taking a seat in the chair opposite him. She did not leave. She simply stayed, a silent, unwavering presence in the wreckage of his composure. He slowly lowered his hands. The mask of the cold, unfeeling Duke was gone. In its place was a man stripped bare, his vulnerability a raw, open wound. He let slip a name, a whisper of agony. Valence. The siege at Valence. It was not an explanation, just a fragment of his nightmare given voice. In that moment the cavernous distance between them, of class, of power, of debt, shrank to nothing. She was no longer just the housekeeper, and he was no longer just the Duke. They were two people sitting in a dark room, weathered by their own storms, one of them just louder than the other. A crack had appeared in the armor of the Duke of Blackwood, and through it Alara had seen the wounded man inside. And the sight did not repel her. It resonated with a deep, quiet part of her own resilient heart. After the night of the storm, a subtle shift occurred in the cold atmosphere of Blackwood Manor. The Duke did not speak of what had happened, and Alara never mentioned it, but an unspoken understanding now existed between them, a fragile truce. He no longer seemed to see her as merely a part of the household machinery. When he passed her in the hall, his glacial gaze would sometimes soften for a fraction of a second, a flicker of awareness, of acknowledgement. He began to emerge from his self-imposed exile in the West Wing. He would appear in the library in the afternoons, ostensibly to read, but Alara knew he was there because she and Leo were often in the adjoining drawing room, where a sliver of sunlight pierced the gloom. He would watch, from behind the pages of his book, as she taught Leo his letters, her voice a soft, patient murmur. Leo, in his childish innocence, was the true bridge between their two disparate worlds. Unburdened by class distinctions or the weight of unspoken history, he was not intimidated by the Duke. One afternoon, he marched directly into the library, his small wooden kestrel clutched in his hand. "Your Grace," he announced, his small face serious. "The bird's wing is broken. Mama says she cannot fix it. She says the wood is split." Alistair looked up from his book, startled. He looked down at the toy bird, then at the boy's earnest, worried face. "I see," he said, his tone gruff. "Can you fix it?" Leo asked, his hope absolute. "Mama says a man who owns a forest must know all about wood." Alara, who had followed Leo, froze in the doorway, mortified. "Leo, do not bother His Grace." But Alistair held up a hand, silencing her. He studied the broken toy. "The dowel has snapped," he said, his voice laced with a surprising gentleness. "It requires a delicate hand." He rose from his chair and gestured for Leo to follow. "Come with me." He led the boy not to a study or a drawing room, but down a long corridor to a small, dusty room at the back of the manor. It was a workshop, wood shavings littered the floor, and the air smelled of sawdust and oil. Tools of all shapes and sizes hung in neat, orderly rows on the walls. Alistair picked up a small piece of dark, fine-grained wood and a delicate-looking knife. With precise, careful movements, he began to carve a new wing. Alara watched from the doorway, mesmerized. His hands, which she had only seen holding reins or signing documents, were surprisingly deft and skillful. There was a quiet focus in his work, a craftsman's peace that seemed at odds with the haunted man from the storm. He was not just a duke. He was a man who could create, who could mend what was broken. He worked in silence for some time, with Leo watching, utterly captivated. "My father taught me," Alistair said suddenly, his eyes still on his work. He believed a man should know how to work with his hands, that it quiets the mind. It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her. A small window into his past, into a time before the war, before the title, before the ice had formed around his heart. When he was finished, he fitted the new, perfectly carved wing onto the bird. It was stronger than before. He handed it back to Leo, whose face lit up with pure joy. "Thank you, Your Grace." "Alistair," the Duke corrected him gently. "You may call me Alistair." The name hung in the air between them, an invitation, an offering. From that day on, a new routine began to form. They would often spend the late afternoons in the workshop, Alistair working on some small project, Alara mending linens, and Leo playing quietly on the floor. In the quiet companionship of the room, they began to talk. Not of the debt or the war or their sorrows, but of simple things. He learned that her father had been a university scholar, a man of books and ideas who had known nothing of finance, which led to their ruin. This explained her quiet intelligence, the way she spoke, the books she chose to read to Leo from the library. His preconceived notions about her, built on the foundations of class and circumstance, crumbled into dust. In turn, she learned small things about him. His favorite author was Tacitus. He had a deep knowledge of botany, inherited from his mother. He had once dreamed of being an architect. Each revelation was a small, careful stone laid across the chasm that separated them. His guilt over the deception he was perpetuating grew with each passing day. The debt was a sham, a tool he had used to bring her here. He had told himself it was to protect her, to contain the fallout from his brother's disastrous dealings with a far more dangerous creditor. His own cousin, Lord Harrington. Harrington was a vulture who would have stripped Alara of everything and thrown her to the wolves. Alistair's plan had been to keep her safe at Blackwood, under his protection, until he could untangle the legal mess and neutralize his cousin. He had rationalized it as a cold, strategic necessity. But it was no longer cold. It was no longer a strategy. He watched her across the workshop, her head bent over her sewing, the firelight catching the warm tones in her dark hair. He felt a fierce, protective pull that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with the woman she was. Her strength, her kindness, her unshakable dignity. He was keeping her here under false pretenses, and the lie was becoming a poison in his soul. He had trapped her in his gilded cage, and now he was falling in love with the bird. The first hint of autumn painted the leaves of the ancient oaks in strokes of gold and crimson. The air grew crisp, and the days shortened, drawing the three of them ever closer to the warmth of the manor's hearths. The oppressive silence of Blackwood had been replaced by a quiet hum of life. It was starting to feel less like a tomb and more like a sanctuary. But sanctuaries are often an illusion. One afternoon, Leo was exploring the overgrown gardens, a place that had become his personal kingdom. Alara was weeding a small patch she had cleared for winter herbs, and Alistair was nearby, pruning a climbing rose that had gone wild. The mood was peaceful, almost domestic. A scream shattered the quiet. It was a child's cry of pure terror. Alara's head snapped up, her blood turning to ice. "Leo!" Alistair was already moving, his ducal reserve vanishing in a surge of adrenaline. He vaulted a low stone wall and plunged into the overgrown thicket where the cry had come from. Alara was right behind him, her heart pounding against her ribs, thorns tearing at her skirts. They found him near the crumbling foundation of an old folly. His leg was caught in the rusted jaws of a poacher's trap, a relic of some forgotten time. He wasn't badly hurt, The teeth were dull with age, but he was trapped and terrified, his face pale with shock. Alistair's military instincts took over. His voice was calm and commanding, a stark contrast to the frantic fear in Alara's chest. "Don't move, Leo. I will get you out." He knelt, his hands working with practiced strength and precision to pry the rusted metal jaws apart. It took all his force, his muscles straining against the unyielding iron. With a final, groaning screech of metal, the trap sprang open. Alara rushed forward, gathering a sobbing Leo into her arms, checking him for injury, murmuring frantic, soothing words. Alistair rose, his breathing heavy. As he pushed himself up, his work shirt, already unbuttoned against the afternoon warmth, pulled taut and then gaped open. Alara, looking up from her son, saw it clearly for the first time. A brutal, jagged scar sliced across the hard plane of his ribs, a puckered, silvered landscape of long-heeled violence. It was not the clean line of a dueling sword, but the ragged, devastating mark of a bayonet or shrapnel. A wound meant to kill. It was a testament to the fact that the man before her had walked through hell and somehow, impossibly, walked out again. Her breath caught in her throat. He saw where she was looking and instinctively moved to pull his shirt closed, a flicker of his old, guarded shame in his eyes. But her expression stopped him. There was no horror in her gaze, no revulsion. There was only a profound, aching empathy that seemed to reach across the space between them and touch the wound itself. Later that evening, after Leo was safely asleep in his bed, a small scratch on his leg, the only physical sign of his ordeal, Alara found Alistair in the library. He was standing by the window, staring out at the moonlit grounds, a glass of whiskey in his hand. "He is sleeping," she said softly from the doorway. Alistair turned. "I should have had the grounds cleared. I should have known those traps were there. It's my fault." "It was an accident," she countered, stepping into the room. She carried a small bowl of water and a cloth. "You were hurt as well," she nodded toward his hand, which he had cut on the rusted metal. It was a shallow wound, but it was bleeding sluggishly. He glanced down at it dismissively. "It is nothing. Let me," she insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument. She set the bowl down and gently took his hand. His skin was calloused but warm. As she carefully cleaned the cut, her touch was light, professional, yet unbearably intimate in the quiet room. The world seemed to shrink to the space between their hands. He watched her, his throat tight. Her focused, gentle care was a balm on wounds far deeper than the cut on his hand. "The debt, Alara," he said, his voice low and strained. "It is not as simple as it seems." She looked up, her moss-green eyes searching his. "It was my brother's folly," he confessed, the words tasting like rust. "He was entangled with dangerous men. When he died, the debt fell to the estate." To me, he paused, choosing his next words with care. He could not tell her the whole truth, not yet. It was too complex, too dangerous. But he had to give her a piece of it. "I am trying to contain the damage, to protect the estate, to protect—" He trailed off, his gaze holding hers. "To protect you." The words were there, unspoken but deafening in the silence. She finished tending to his hand, her fingers lingering on his for a heart-stopping moment before she drew away. She did not question him further. She simply accepted his partial confession, sensing the deeper truths he was not yet able to voice. She saw the burden he carried, the weight of a name, a title, a brother's sins. She saw the honorable man struggling beneath the cold exterior. The rescue, the scar, the confession, they had irrevocably altered the foundation of their relationship. The pretense of employer and employee was dissolving, eroded by shared fear and shared vulnerability. A new, more perilous, and infinitely more powerful connection was taking its place. In the weeks that followed, the fragile bud of their connection began to blossom in the sheltered quiet of Blackwood Manor. The autumn deepened, and the world outside seemed to retreat, leaving them in a self-contained universe of firelight and lengthening shadows. The unspoken tension between them was a constant, living thing, a taut wire of awareness that hummed in the air whenever they were in the same room. Alistair found himself orchestrating his days around the possibility of seeing her. He would take his papers to the morning room, knowing she would be there dusting, just to catch the scent of lemon and lavender that always seemed to cling to her. He taught Leo how to play chess in the library, his deep voice explaining the moves of knights and bishops, but his eyes would stray to Alara, who sat mending by the fire, her presence a silent, calming anchor in his turbulent world. He was a man awakening from a long, frozen slumber. The colors of the world seemed sharper, the taste of his food richer, the air itself cleaner. Alara had not just brought order to his house. She had brought life back into him. He started to smile, small, rusty things at first, but genuine. He laughed, a low, startling rumble in his chest, when Leo checkmated him with a triumphant cry. The sound echoed in the vast room, a ghost of the man he had been before the war, before the grief. Alara, too, was changing. The weary tension in her shoulders had begun to ease. She found herself watching him, noticing the way a stray lock of dark hair fell across his brow when he was concentrating, the surprising kindness in his hands when he showed Leo how to hold a carving knife, the deep sadness that still lingered in his eyes even when he smiled. She saw past the Duke, past the scars, to the lonely, honorable man beneath. The fear she once felt had long since been replaced by a deep, resonant compassion, which was slowly, terrifyingly, turning into something more. One evening, a cold, biting wind rattled the window panes, a harbinger of the coming winter. A fire roared in the massive hearth of the library, casting a warm, golden glow over the room. Leo was long asleep upstairs. Alistair had been reading, and Alara had been cataloging a new set of books that had arrived, her handwriting a neat, elegant script in the heavy ledger. The silence was comfortable, companionable. "My mother loved this room," Alistair said, his voice startling her. He had closed his book and was staring into the flames. "She said it was the heart of the house. After she died, my father had it closed off. He couldn't bear to be in here without her." He had never spoken of his parents before. Alara stopped writing, turning on her stool to give him her full attention. "He was never the same," Alistair continued, his voice low and reflective. "It was as if the color had drained from his world. I am beginning to understand how that feels." His gaze lifted from the fire and found hers across the room. The admission was raw, vulnerable, a confession of his own long years spent in a colorless world. She felt her heart ache for the boy he must have been, losing a mother and then, in a way, a father too. "It is a testament to her that she was so deeply loved," Alara said softly. "Grief is the price we pay for love. I have spent years trying to avoid paying it," he admitted, a wry, sad twist to his lips. "I built walls. I kept the world out. I kept everything out." He looked around the room, at the warm fire, at the books she had arranged at her. "You have breached my defenses, Mrs. Fletcher." "Alara," she corrected him quietly. "Alara," he repeated, the name a soft caress on the air. He rose from his chair and walked slowly toward her. The space between them crackled with a sudden, intense energy. He stopped just before her, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. He smelled of old books, wood smoke, and whiskey. He reached out, his fingers gently tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was electric, sending a shiver through her entire body. "I never intended for this to happen," he whispered, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "This arrangement, it was meant to be simple, practical." "Nothing about you is simple, Alistair," she breathed, her own voice unsteady. His glacial gray eyes were dark with 1,000 unspoken feelings. Yearning, regret, a desperate, hungry hope. He lowered his head, his gaze dropping to her lips. The world stopped. There was only the roar of the fire and the frantic, wild beating of her own heart. He leaned in and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion, not at first. It was a question, a tentative exploration, as gentle and hesitant as his own reawakening heart. His lips were soft, searching. She responded instinctively, her hand coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the solid, steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. The gentleness gave way. The kiss deepened, becoming a raw, desperate expression of all the loneliness, all the longing, all the pain they had both held inside for so long. It was a kiss that spoke of desolate battlefields and cold, empty cottages, of silent grief and fierce, protective love. It was a promise of warmth in a world that had been relentlessly cold. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "Ilara," he murmured again, as if her name were a prayer. In that perfect, firelit moment, they were not a duke and his housekeeper. They were just a man and a woman who had found an impossible sanctuary in each other's arms. But sanctuaries built on secrets are made of glass, and they both knew, in the deepest parts of their souls, that the storm was not over. It was only just beginning. The fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered 2 days later by the arrival of a gleaming black carriage, pulled by 4 perfectly matched gray horses. It was an ostentatious display of wealth and power that was utterly alien to the brooding austerity of Blackwood. From it emerged a man who was the Duke's opposite in every way. He was handsome in a smooth, polished way, dressed in the height of London fashion, and his smile was a brilliant, predatory thing that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. Lord Harrington, Alastair's cousin, had arrived. Alastair met him in the great hall, his body rigid, his face a mask of stone. "Harrington, this is an unexpected and unwelcome surprise." "Cousin," Harrington boomed, his voice overly jovial. He clapped Alastair on the shoulder, a gesture of false familiarity. "Is that any way to greet your family? I was in the neighborhood and thought I would see how you were faring in your splendid isolation." And his eyes swept the hall, a flicker of something covetous in their depths. "To inquire about a small business matter are late," lamented Cousin George, left unresolved. Ilara, who had been on her way to the kitchens, stopped in the shadows of an archway, an instinctive sense of dread coiling in her stomach. This was the man Alastair had spoken of, the dangerous man. "Your business with my brother is concluded," Alastair said, his voice lethally quiet. "It is now my business, and I am handling it." Harrington's smile widened. "Ah, yes, I heard you had found a most creative solution to the Fletcher debt. Very resourceful of you." Alastair, his gaze slid past Alastair and landed directly on Ilara, who stood frozen in the shadows. His eyes raked over her, insolent and assessing, and a slow, malicious understanding dawned on his face. "Ah, I see. A very personal solution." Later that day, Harrington found her alone in the garden, where she was gathering the last of the mint. He approached her silently, his expensive leather boots making no sound on the soft earth. "Mrs. Fletcher, is it not?" he began, his voice smooth as oiled silk. "I am Lord Harrington, Alastair's cousin." "My lord," she said, dipping into a brief curtsy, her heart thudding with apprehension. "My cousin is a man of peculiar tastes," Harrington continued, circling her like a wolf. "He hides himself away in this dreary pile of rock, nursing his wounds, both real and imagined. It must be terribly lonely for him. And for you, of course, a pretty widow, indebted, at the mercy of a powerful man. It is a classic tale." "His Grace has been fair," Ilara said, her voice tight. Harrington laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Fair? My dear woman, you have no idea what kind of man my cousin is. Do you truly believe he brought you here to be his housekeeper? A man like Alastair with his fortune? He could hire 100 housekeepers." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Let me tell you the truth of it. The debt your husband incurred? It was a pittance, meaningless to a man like Alastair. It was a fiction, Mrs. Fletcher. A pretext. An excuse." Ilara stared at him, her mind refusing to process the words. "An excuse for what?" "For this." Harrington gestured around them. "For you." He saw a vulnerable, attractive woman, trapped by circumstance. He contrived a way to possess you, to install you in his home where he could have you all to himself, without the bother and scandal of a marriage proposal. He used that paltry debt to trap you, to make you his creature. And you, it seems, have fallen for it completely. The world tilted on its axis. Every kind word, every shared moment, every gentle touch was instantly recast in a sickening, predatory light. The kiss by the fire, was it an act of affection or an act of ownership? The vulnerability he'd shown, was it real or a calculated performance to win her trust? The poison of Harrington's words seeped into her, chilling her to the bone. "You lie," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. A terrible, cold dread was blooming in her chest. "Do I?" Harrington's smile was triumphant. Ask him if the debt was ever real to him. Ask him why he didn't simply pay it off and let you go on your way. The answer is simple. He didn't want you to go. At that moment, Alistair strode into the garden, his face a thundercloud. Harrington, leave her alone. He had heard the last part of the conversation. He saw the venom in his cousin's eyes and, worse, the shattered, horrified look on Alara's face. She turned to him, her own eyes wide with a pain so profound it was like a physical blow. The trust they had so carefully built lay in ruins around them. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling, on the edge of breaking. "Was the debt just a way to bring me here? A lie?" Alistair looked at her, trapped. How could he explain the complex truth? How could he say, yes, it was a lie, but it was a lie to protect you from him? In that moment, faced with the wreckage in her eyes, the words would sound like the lamest of excuses, another manipulation. His silence, his hesitation as he struggled to find the right words, was the only answer she needed. It was true. A sob, sharp and broken, escaped her lips. The betrayal was absolute. It was a blade twisting in her heart, sharper than any poverty, crueler than any grief. She looked at the man she had allowed herself to love, the man she had thought she'd seen beneath the scars, and saw only a stranger, a liar, captor. "I see," she whispered, her voice devoid of all emotion. She took a step back from him, then another. She wrapped her arms around herself, as if to hold the pieces of her broken heart together. And without another word, she turned and fled back toward the cold, stone prison he had built for her. That night, the manor was plunged back into a silence deeper and more profound than any that had come before. It was the silence of a tomb, the silence of a broken heart. Alara did not weep. Her grief was a cold, hard knot in her chest, too deep for tears. She moved with a numb, mechanical efficiency, packing her few meager belongings and Leo's into a single worn satchel. The coat the boy had tried to mend, the wooden kestrel with its new wing, the few books she had owned. Leo watched her, his small face etched with confusion and fear. "Are we leaving, Mama?" "Yes, my love," she said, her voice a hollow echo of itself. "We are going away. But I like it here. I like Alistair." The name was a fresh stab of pain. "We cannot stay," was all she could manage. Alistair came to her room. He knocked, but she did not answer. He opened the door to find her tying the drawstrings on the satchel. The finality of the image was like a physical blow. "Alara, please," he began, his voice raw. "Let me explain. It's not what you think. Harrington. Do not speak his name to me." She cut him off, her voice dangerously quiet. She turned to face him, and her eyes were not filled with tears, but with a cold, clear fire of righteous fury and shattered pride. "And do not insult my intelligence by trying to explain away your deceit. You used my poverty, my desperation, against me. You played upon my sympathy. You made me believe. You made me feel." She couldn't finish the sentence. The intimacy they had shared now felt like the deepest violation. "Everything that happened between us was real," he insisted, taking a step toward her. "Stop," she commanded, and he froze. "Do not come any closer. You are the Duke of Blackwood. You hold all the power, but you do not own me." "You do not own my dignity." She picked up the satchel. "Your Grace," she said, the formal title a deliberate, cutting slap. "You have been paid in full. My service in this house is complete." She took Leo's hand and walked toward the door. Alistair stood in her way, his face a mask of anguish. "Where will you go? It's the middle of the night. You have no money, nowhere to turn." "That is no longer your concern," she said, her voice like ice. "I would rather scrub floors in the meanest tavern in the village than spend one more night under the roof of a liar." She brushed past him, her shoulder making no contact, as if he were a ghost. He could have stopped her. He was stronger, he could have barred the door. But he knew it would only prove Harrington's accusations true. All he could do was watch in despair as she walked down the grand staircase, her back straight, her small son's hand held tight in hers. He watched as she opened the heavy front door and walked out into the cold, unforgiving darkness, swallowed by the night. The door clicked shut, the sound echoing through the cavernous hall like the tolling of a funeral bell. Alistair was alone. The warmth, the light, the life she had brought into his desolate world. It was all gone. He was left with the suffocating silence, the ghosts of his past, and the fresh, agonizing specter of his own failure. He had tried to be her protector and had become her jailer. He had tried to shield her from a monster, only to become a monster in her eyes. The fortress he had built around his heart had been breached, not by an enemy, but by love. And then he, with his own pride and his own secrets, had razed it to the ground. Alara found a room in the village above the baker's shop. It was small and drafty, but it was hers. She paid for the first week's rent with the few coins she had saved, and then she set out to find work. She took on any job she could find. Mending for the tailor, washing for the inn, scrubbing the floors of the church. Her hands, which had just begun to soften at the manor, were once again chapped and raw. She was exhausted, bone-weary, but she was free. Every coin she earned was a testament to her own strength, her own resilience. She was proving to herself that she was not a victim, not a pawn in a duke's game. But at night, when Leo was asleep, the facade would crumble. The memory of Alistair's kiss, of the vulnerability in his eyes during the storm, of the gentle way he'd mended her son's toy, it all returned to haunt her. Her heart was a battlefield, the anger and betrayal warring with a love that refused to die. She hated him for his deception, but she grieved for the man she thought she had known, the man she had loved. Back at Blackwood, Alistair was living in his own self-made hell. The manor was once again a tomb, but now it was filled with the ghost of her laughter, the scent of her presence. Every room held a memory. He saw her by the fire in the library, in the garden with the roses, in his workshop, her head bent over her sewing. His cousin Harrington had left, his work done, leaving Alistair to stew in the poison he had spread. For days, Alistair was paralyzed by despair. He drank, he stared into the fire, he paced the lonely corridors. But then, a new feeling began to burn through the fog of his grief. Rage. A cold, clear, calculating rage directed not at Alara, but at his cousin, and at the system of aristocratic privilege that allowed men like Harrington to prey on the vulnerable. And beneath the rage was a desperate clarity. Words were not enough. Apologies were meaningless without action. He had broken her trust with a grand deception. He could only hope to earn it back with a grand, undeniable act of truth. He summoned his solicitor from London. He locked himself in his study, not with a bottle of brandy, but with ledgers, deeds, and correspondence. He worked with the same fierce, focused intensity he had once applied to battle plans. He was no longer just the wounded recluse. He was the Duke of Blackwood, and he was finally going to wield the power of his title not for protection, but for justice. He began by investigating every aspect of his late brother's finances, following the tangled threads that all led back to Harrington. He uncovered not just one fraudulent debt, but a dozen. His cousin had been running a predatory scheme for years, targeting minor gentry and tenants, ensnaring them in a web of debt and then stripping them of their assets. Alara's husband had been just one of many victims. Alastair gathered sworn affidavits from other families who had been ruined. He found discrepancies in Harrington's own ledgers, evidence of forgery. He built his case with meticulous, irrefutable precision. He was not just clearing Ilara's name. He was dismantling his cousin's entire corrupt enterprise. The culmination of his efforts was a formal hearing before the regional magistrate, a man of unimpeachable integrity. Alastair convened the hearing not in some stuffy office, but in the village town hall, ensuring it was a public affair. He summoned Lord Harrington to attend, a summons his cousin could not ignore without raising suspicion. On the day of the hearing, the hall was packed. Villagers and tenants stood alongside local gentry. Ilara was there, standing at the back, her face pale but resolute. She had heard what was happening and had to see it for herself, her heart a tangled knot of dread and a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. Alastair stood before the assembly, not as a defendant, but as an accuser. He was dressed in the severe black of his station, his presence commanding, his voice clear and strong as he laid out the case against his cousin. He presented the evidence piece by piece. The forged signatures, the testimony of ruined families, the trail of money that led directly to Harrington's accounts. It was a masterful, damning indictment. Harrington, who had arrived with a confident smirk, grew paler with each new piece of evidence. He blustered, he denied, but the weight of the proof was overwhelming. Finally, Alastair came to the matter of the Fletcher debt. "The final piece of evidence," he announced, his voice ringing through the silent hall, "concerns the debt levied against the late Thomas Fletcher, which I myself held. I confess before you all that I knew this debt to be suspect. In my misguided attempt to shield Mrs. Fletcher from Lord Harrington's further machinations, I perpetuated a falsehood. I used the debt to bring her and her son to my home under my protection. My methods were wrong. They were deceitful, and they caused unforgivable pain to a woman of unimpeachable character and strength." His eyes found Ilara's at the back of the hall. He was speaking directly to her now, his public confession a raw, painful act of atonement. "For my actions I am solely to blame, but the crime itself belongs to Lord Harrington. I have, therefore, cancelled the Fletcher debt completely. Furthermore," he declared, his voice rising with authority, "I have placed £100,000 from my personal fortune into a new trust, to be administered by this court. This trust will fully compensate every family defrauded by Lord Harrington, and will serve as a fund to protect others from such predatory actions in the future. His campaign of ruin ends today." A gasp went through the crowd. It was a staggering sum, a gesture of almost unimaginable scale. It was not just an apology. It was restitution. It was justice. The magistrate, after reviewing the final pieces of evidence, had no choice. He issued a warrant for Lord Harrington's arrest and froze all his assets pending a full trial. Harrington was ruined, his reputation destroyed, his web of deceit torn apart. Alastair did not stay to watch his cousin's downfall. As soon as the magistrate had spoken, he made his way through the stunned crowd, his eyes fixed on only one person. He walked directly to Ilara. He did not go to her as a duke making a proclamation. He went to her as a man, humbled and broken, seeking redemption. He stopped a few feet from her, in the small, drafty room above the bakery that had become her refuge. He had shed his ducal finery and wore the simple, practical clothes of a country gentleman. The power, the title, the wealth, he had set it all aside. He had come to her with nothing but the truth. "Ilara," he began, his voice quiet, stripped of all its former authority. "What I did today, it was not to buy your forgiveness. Cannot be bought. It was what justice demanded. What I should have done from the very beginning." She watched him, her heart aching. She had seen him wield his power like a sword, not for himself, but for others, for her. "I fell in love with your strength, your kindness, your spirit," he continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw in you everything that was good and true in a world I believed was only darkness. And in my fear of feeling anything, my fear of losing you, I chose the wrong path. I hid behind lies because I didn't trust that the truth of who I am was worthy of you. He took a hesitant step closer. I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I am asking anyway. Not for your pity, not for your gratitude. I am asking for a second chance. A chance to build something real, something honest. I built our beginning on a lie, Alara. Please, allow me to build our future on the truth. He stood before her, the great and powerful Duke of Blackwood, his heart laid bare, his fate entirely in her hands. The scars on his face and soul were no longer hidden. He was offering her not his protection, but his vulnerability. Not his power, but his love. Alara looked at the man before her. She saw the pain in his eyes, the profound regret, but she also saw the change. He had faced his own demons, not in the dark of a stormy night, but in the bright light of day, before the entire world. He had torn down the walls around his heart and around his life. He had not come to rescue her from her poverty. He had come to ask her to rescue him from his loneliness. Tears finally welled in her eyes, not tears of sorrow or betrayal, but of a deep, cleansing release. The love she had fought so hard to extinguish was still there, stronger than ever, purified in the crucible of truth. Alistair, she whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out and laid her hand against his cheek, right beside the pale, silvered scar. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch as if it were the only anchor in a storm-tossed sea. The future, she said softly, a tremulous smile touching her lips, is a place I would like to build with you. His eyes opened, and in their glacial depths, a sun was rising. It was the beginning of a forgiveness that would be earned, a trust that would be rebuilt day by day, but it was a beginning. He had made his grand gesture, but her quiet act of grace, her simple touch, was the true foundation of their new world. They were married a month later in the small village church. It was a quiet ceremony, attended only by a few villagers, the baker and his wife, and a very proud little boy who served as his new father's witness. The union of a duke and a common housekeeper was a scandal that rippled through the drawing rooms of London. But in the windswept hills surrounding Blackwood, it was simply a story of two wounded souls who had found their way home. Blackwood Manor was transformed. Alara, now the Duchess of Blackwood, filled its rooms with light and life. The dust sheets were banished forever, replaced by bright fabrics and vases of fresh flowers from the gardens she had lovingly restored to their former glory. The sound of Leo's laughter echoed in the once silent halls, a constant, joyful melody. Alistair was transformed as well. The shadows in his eyes receded, replaced by a quiet, steady warmth. He was still a man marked by his past, but his scars no longer defined him. They were simply a part of the story that had led him to her. He became a respected, if still reserved, landlord, known for his fairness and his unwavering commitment to justice for his tenants. One cool autumn evening, a year after their wedding, they stood on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The setting sun painted the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Leo was chasing fireflies on the lawn below, his small figure a darting shadow in the twilight. Alistair slid his arm around Alara's waist, pulling her close. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her hand resting over his on her gently swelling belly. "Are you happy, Alara?" he asked softly, his voice full of a quiet wonder, as if he still couldn't believe his own good fortune. She turned her face up to his, her eyes shining with a love that was deep and true, forged in misunderstanding and tempered by forgiveness. She thought of the cold, desperate woman she had been, stitching a coat in a drafty cottage, and the cold, broken man he had been, a prisoner in his own home. They had saved each other. "More than I ever thought possible," she whispered. He bent his head and kissed her, a slow, lingering kiss full of promises kept and a future yet to be written. The great, brooding fortress of Blackwood Manor stood behind them, its stone walls now warmed by the fires of a home, a testament to the quiet triumph of a love that had been built not on a foundation of power or wealth, but on the simple, mended fabric of two hearts.